Hi guys and welcome back. In this video we're going to talk about static methods and class methods. These can be a little bit confusing, so let's get started. Here we've got a class that I have called class test. This is just to show you how these things work. And then we have defined a method. We know it's a method because it is a function which starts with a def keyword and it has self as a first parameter. All functions inside the class that use the object as the first parameter are called instance methods. And this instance method prints that you've called the instance method. So how would you call this method if you wanted to call it? You have two options. Okay, the first option is to do something like test equal class test and create a new object of type class test. Notice that we don't have an init method in this class, but that's okay. If you don't have an init method, that just means that you don't have any initialization to do, but the self is still created and you still get a new object and make it equal to your variable. So here we're creating a new object and you can do test.instance method, or as we know, you can do class test.instance method with test as the argument. So both of these things are exactly the same. If you run this code, you'll get that you've called the instance method of this object. Notice that we are printing the object self here, and as we saw earlier on, you get back this ugly printout. If you wanted it to be a little bit nicer, you would have to implement your str or repr methods, one of the two. But for now, we have called the instance method 2 times. It is called an instance method because you call it on a class instance. The name instance means the same thing as an object. So what we're doing here is we're creating an object of type class test, and you can also say that you're creating an instance of class test. They mean the same thing. So that is why these are called instance methods. So instance methods need the object in order to call them. The next type is called a class method. Here you can define another method, but now instead of the instance or the object self, it actually takes a different parameter that we usually in Python call CLS, but you can call this parameter whatever you want. The value will still be the same no matter what you call this parameter. And what this parameter will be in a class method, that is when you put this @class method on top of the method definition, is this will be the class itself. So let me show you how this works. Called class method of CLS. I'll just print the parameter there, and then because it is a class method, it's not an instance method, you no longer need an instance. That means that you can just do class test.class method, and that's it. You don't have to pass in anything in there because we no longer need the object. Python is smart enough that when you do class test.class method and you don't pass anything in there, Python will actually pass class test in there. So actually CLS is class test because that is what you called the method on. So that is how this works. When you do class test.class method, given that you have put this @class method on top, we're going to learn what this is later on, don't worry about it too much, then Python will pass in the class as the argument to this parameter. So if we save and play, you'll see that now you get that you've called the class method of this class called the class test. Don't worry too much about the __main __. We will learn about that later on if it becomes relevant. It's largely irrelevant to most Python programs. This just means that you've called the class method of this class. We're going to find use cases for class methods in just a little bit later on in this video. Finally, the last option is the @static method. And this defines a static method that I'm going to call static method. Again, you can call it whatever you want. And now I'm not going to put anything inside the brackets. So here we're going to do call static method. In a static method, that is a method that doesn't have a parameter CLS or self, and that has @static method on top, these methods don't get anything when you call them. So the class method gets the class normally, and you can print it out or use it. The instance method gets the instance or the object, and you can print it out or use it in them. But static methods don't get either of those things. And you can call them in the same way just by doing static method inside class test, so class test.static method, but Python will not put the class test in the brackets, it will just call that method. This really isn't a method, it's just a function that you've placed inside a class. We should still call it a method, but it doesn't have any information about the class or the object, so it's really just its own separate function that lives inside the class. So if you want a function inside a class that doesn't use the class for anything or the instance, you can decorate it with @static method. If you want a method that uses the class for something, then you can decorate it with @class method. And if you want to use the object, or if you want to create any other type of instance method, then just don't put anything on top, no @class method or @static method, and make sure to include your parameter there. Again, if you call this like that and you press play, you just get called static method. So what are these used for? Instance methods are used for most things. When you want to produce an action that uses the data inside the object that you created earlier on, for example, that is when instance methods would get used. Also, if you want to call a method to modify some sort of data inside self or the object, then you would also use an instance method. Class methods are used often as factories, and I'm going to show you what that is in a second. And finally, static methods are used to just place a method inside a class because you feel like it belongs there for some reason. For you as a developer, you want to put that method in there because it makes sense logically for like code organization or something like that, then you can use that. I'll say though that most of the time you'll be using class methods and instance methods. You won't be using static methods all that much. Let's start with our factory example that is going to show you how you might use a class method. This example is going to be a little bit tricky, so please bear with me for a second while I explain first what I've done here. In a class, as well as methods, you can also put variables, and these become class properties. So if you wanted to print out this tuple here, all you have to do is access the types tuple inside the book class. So you would do book.types. And that is how you access this tuple there. You can print it out and you can see that you get hardcover and paperback. Okay, so we have some data stored inside the class, which is this tuple here. And a reason why you might put some data inside a class as opposed to putting it outside the class is because you feel like it belongs there, or only the book class is going to use it, or maybe there is some sort of reason, logical reason to put that data in there. Here I'm creating a class that talks about books, so it makes sense to have book types inside there. Then we're going to create an init method for this class. Remember, because this is an instance method, it creates an instance and gives it back to you. You need the self parameter there. You can call self whatever you want, once again, but the convention in Python is to call it self. And then we're going to be creating objects of type book that have three things: a name, a book type, and a weight. So we will do self.name equal name, self.booktype equal book type, and self.weight equal weight. This is a very common thing in Python to create an object with three different values that you then store each one inside a property of the object itself. So just to recap, if you were to create a variable such as book and make it an object, then you would need to pass in some information. Let's say Harry Potter, hardcover, and 1500. Then you can print book.name. And what that's going to do is it's going to pass in Harry Potter as the value for this parameter. Then that is going to be assigned to the name property of the self object, which is essentially an empty container at this stage. And then we're going to print it out down here. So if we press play, you'll see that Harry Potter comes out. So that's how the data is flowing through this system at this stage. Then I'm also going to create a repr method so that it's a little bit easier to work with these books. And we are going to return a book with this name. It is this book type, and it's weighing self.weight grams. Okay, so this is a representation of the book that would allow us, with all the data included inside, to recreate a book object if we wanted to. Remember, that is the purpose of the repr method. If you wanted to just print the book out nicely for users to read, then you could use the str method instead. So now, instead of printing book name, we're just going to print book, and I will press play and show you what the output is. Here's the book Harry Potter, which is a hardcover weighing 1500 grams. Now we come into the factories. So here's where we're going to use class methods. I want to avoid, when I'm creating a new book object, when I'm calling the init method, I want to avoid passing in this hardcover string because I only want to be able to create books that are either hardcover or paperback. I want to make sure that when I create a book, I use one of these two types. Right now, I can pass in comic book if I wanted to here, and that would be totally fine because, again, the data, this string here, becomes the value of book type. Book type gets assigned to self.booktype, and that gets used down here. There is no check for this. Nothing is using this at the moment. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a method that will take in the name and the weight and will create a new book object of type hardcover. So I'm going to call this class method hardcover. And again, because it is a class method, it takes in the class as the first parameter. Usually call that CLS in Python. And then it's going to take in the name and the page weight. And what it's going to do is it is going to return a book with the name as the first argument, which then goes into the init method, book.types 0 as the second argument. Remember, book.types gives us this tuple, book.types 0 gives us the hardcover, and finally the page weight plus 100 for the weight of the book. I'm adding 100 because it's a hardcover, so it's probably going to be a little heavier than a paperback. So hopefully this makes sense. It is a little bit confusing because you are using the class inside a method defined inside the class, which I know is a little bit weird, but that is how you can create a new object inside of a class. This is something you can totally do. And because it is a class method, you no longer need to create your own object first. All you have to do now is say book.hardcover and pass in here Harry Potter and the page weight, which was 1500. Notice that this hardcover method takes in the name and the page weight, but it does not take in a type. The type is added inside the method. You don't have to pass it in as an argument. So if I save and run that, you can see that now you get a book, Harry Potter, which is a hardcover and weighs 1600 grams. Let's do the same thing for the paperback. Only now instead of book types 0, I'm going to do book types 1, and I'm going to remove this plus 100. So now if we wanted to create a soft cover book or a paperback, you can say something like light equal book.paperback Python 101, and you can say, for example, 600. If you then print the light book as well, you'll see that you get two books printed out now. Book Harry Potter, which is a hardcover, weighing 1600 grams, and book Python 101, which is a paperback, weighing 600 grams. So this is a very, very common way of using class methods. Because you have access to the class itself inside the method, that means that it is a perfect place to be creating new objects by using that class. With that said, though, notice that I am using book here, and I'm not using CLS anywhere. Book is the class, as we saw earlier on. And CLS is also the class. So they are interchangeable. Instead of book, you can put CLS in there. And instead of book down here, you can put CLS in there. You should do that. Use CLS instead of book, and that will come in handy when you look at inheritance, which we will look at later on. Just because using CLS gives you a little bit more flexibility down the line. So do use CLS there, since you've got access to it. And if you were creating a static method instead of a class method, you would have to use book class because you wouldn't have CLS. So if you want to use CLS, use a class method, use the parameter, and you can create new objects and return them or use them however you like. Hopefully this makes sense. I know that it's a little bit confusing. You're looking at class methods and static methods, and this has been a bit of a long video, but hopefully it was helpful. Hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you in the next one.